Thank you for meeting me today with this interview opportunity.
Thanks for having me.
Just for our audience that will watch this video later, I would like to introduce you very briefly. So, Zachary D. Carter is graduated from the University of Virginia, where he studied philosophy and politics. He is a consultant with the Hewlett Foundation's Economy and Society Initiative. He was previously a writer in residence with the Omidyar Network's Reimagining Capitalism initiative and spent 10 years as a senior reporter at HuffPost, where he covered economic policy and American politics. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, the New Republic, the Nation, the American Prospect, and other outlets. And today we will have an interview on Keynesianism and on his book, The Price of Peace, Money, Democracy, and the Life of John Maynard Keynes. Thank you again for accepting our offer.
So nice to be talking to you.
So it has been 4 years since you published the first edition of the book, and it's quite a long time. And I'm actually so normally I think authors are willing to talk about their books right after their application, but 4 years is a long period of time. So I'd like to start with a question: that what has changed during this 4 years in terms of your perception of Keynes and Keynesianism?
That's a great question. I think about Keynes all the time. When you spend years studying a person and going through their personal correspondence and essays they wrote over the course of decades, it becomes inevitable that you start seeing the world a little bit through their eyes. And I think to some extent it's hard to separate um, Keynes himself from the Keynes that I've sort of internalized through that process. Keynes himself was a thinker who changed his mind quite famously several times over the course of his career. He had incredible confidence in his own abilities, even as he revised his general theory of how the world and the economy worked over and over again, which of course suggests that he was wrong in several iterations of his very confident beliefs about how the economy works. Um, and I think he changed his mind in response to crises, and we've had a couple of those lately, right? And also in response to the way politics reacted to economic crises, and also the way economies responded to political crises, particularly with regard to the gold standard and World War One. I think, when the book came out, it was sort of, I think the general perception was that in the United States, at least, was that the Obama administration had undershot on its fiscal support in 2009, either just by getting the numbers wrong or being politically constrained in that way. And then hadn't done enough to support demand in general over the course of the presidency. Again, you can blame politics or you can blame bad math, but either way, I think that was the consensus of what had happened. Um, I think what happened in the COVID shock was that we started attending to supply risks. And supply side economics since the 80s had been associated basically with tax cuts and deregulation, things that make it easier for corporations and particularly large corporations um, to secure higher profits. Uh, and there's actually a wealth of more robust and interesting supply side economics and a whole tradition of supply side Keynesianism going back to Keynes himself before the word Keynesianism was used. So, in particular, I've spent a lot of the last couple of years looking at the material on Keynes in World War One and then to a lesser extent in World War Two, when he was operating and the world was operating under the severe supply constraints created by World War One and World War Two. And so I think that section of the book ends up being much more interesting today than I thought it would be when I wrote it. I mean, I remember my editor at the time saying, we need to say more about what he was actually doing during World War One. And it was 2018 or something when I was working on that draft. Like, why? Nobody cares. And now I think, oh my God, glad we went into depth on the Italian wheat shipments and things like that. You know, he was very concerned about making sure there was enough food, enough raw materials to build, to supply everything from, uniforms to soldiers to munitions, stuff that, we don't normally associate with the sort of public abundance, public subsidies for for working people that I think Keynesianism is associated with in the United States, at least.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, when we look at the global economy at the moment, we do not think how we get the things that we do because they come through very complex supply chains. So we just think that it is coming from a deepless pit, but actually it has its own constraints and restrictions. And thinking about what Keynes did in the crisis time during the World War One puts a light in our supply chain crisis at the moment as well.
Yeah, and he had to study this stuff. He was the head of the British Treasury during World War One. For those of you who haven't done the reading, and he actually had to study where do we get rubber from, where do we get pork and all these things that British people were consuming, and to some extent, I think that art of finding out and studying what's actually happening in the productive sectors of the economy. It sort of fell out of favor in at least in the American economics tradition, and people focus more on macroeconomic aggregates. I think to some extent because the success, or at least the perceived success of Keynesian management in the 60s and 70s, maybe I should say the 50s and 60s, but mid 20th century, gave economists the belief that if you manage these large aggregates, that the rest of the picture would take care of itself. And I think the COVID crash and all of the difficulties we've had over the last 4 years, resulting from the war in Ukraine, the conflict in Israel, Palestine, all of this stuff looks like the type of resource pressure that Keynes was dealing with during the wars, but also it just reminds us that sometimes the best thing the economists can do is actually just study what's happening in the world rather than devise grand theories about how they would like it to work.
Yes, and Keynes had different methodologies throughout his time when he was trying to explain his ideas on both the supply chain manners and later on his ideas that the state should just spend more, the state apparatus should be used in order to achieve economic welfare. But his earlier methodology was problematic in terms of addressing to the actual audience, the Western European and American policymakers. So with the publication of his general theory, he's changed that attitude and just left the journalistic, very short and understandable explanations that address the public, but rather started to get behind those mysticism of the academia in order to address the policymakers. So my question is that with your book, you actually do something very similar with Keynes's general theory, because you try to address the academia and not to short journalism work. So do you actually, with similar to Keynes, try to address the Western policymakers as well?
It's hard to say when I wrote. I mean, now I do. I'm a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace now. My bio on my website is slightly out of date, but the Hewlett Foundation work was very similar. I mean, the idea behind that work is not necessarily to like sell thousands, millions of books or something, or resonate with the broadest popular public, but to be read by influential people in positions of power. So that is what think tanks have always done. And I think to some extent, if you look at the way journalism has functioned over the last 20 years or so, there is a popular press, at least in the United States, but I don't know how sort of causally effective it is with the public in general. I think to some extent the press actually serves as a sort of pipeline to people in power and as a set of conversations among powerful people, rather than a set of, an active public discourse in which ordinary people are trying to learn what's going on and figure out how to make the world a better place. Um, I don't have a robust theory about how to change the world for the better. I think everybody who works in intellectual spaces, whether it's economics or you know, literature or history or whatever, wants to be read and wants to have some influence. Um, I think when I wrote the book, I was just trying. I honestly, journalism is a fairly precarious profession in the United States. I mean, the industry's been contracting for as long as I've been in it, and I kind of just wanted to have like an escape hatch. If I could write a book that was well received, then maybe I could get a book contract. So I was thinking very narrowly about how to preserve a career as a writer when I started the project. Um, I think there's a funny play between the public and the elite. I mean, I think one reason why, I mean, this book was fairly popular with at least American elites. I think one reason for that is because it also sold pretty well. Like it was a bestseller, and I think I, people on both sides of the elite popular divide become interested in things because they believe the other side is interested in whatever it is. And so it just sort of ended, it's when you write a book, it's you have very little control about how it is received. I mean, I think this was published in May of 2020. So it was right during like the pandemic when things were getting really out of control, at least in the United States. And people were also reading a lot at that moment. So it was it was sort of a strange coincidence of or confluence of factors. But I can't say that I was pursuing any particular deliberate strategy for re-injecting Keynes into the world. I think it just kind of hit at a fortuitous time.
And I don't think that's sorry, my bad. So when I reached you as a Turkish audience, did you surprise because I don't know, maybe Keynes being read in a global South country, an audience that maybe you have never imagined that your book would have reached. So
Well, my book contract for Keynes, I signed the English language rights with Random House, and then over time, different countries, different languages, people would approach us asking for a translation. So I did remember that we had done a Turkish translation. But honestly, when you reached out to me, I just remembered my wife and I went to Istanbul and to Cappadocia for our honeymoon when we were
oh,
married. So the first thing I thought was, ah, I love that country. It'd be great to talk to people there.
well, yeah, thank you for that comment.
Pardon me for pandering to the audience, but Istanbul, I mean, Queen of Cities.
Oh, thank you. And to turn to Keynes and his ideas, I mean, Keynes is a very interesting figure in terms of his characteristics because he seems to be a very internationalist guy. That's because he's married to a Russian ballet, a very transnational intellectual that thinks just across borders. But also he has a certain commitment to the British government as well because. Beyond being just British, he also served to the government for years. So my inquiry is about Keynes and his ideas on United States, Great Britain, and IMF. When his ideas on IMF were discussed in the Bretton Woods conference, he said that the United States, as the global financial power at the moment, should supply IMF. But if the United States was not the global power at the moment, but it was the Great Britain as it was in the 19th century, would Keynes still insist on Great Britain financing International Monetary Fund in order to, supply the international development?
It's a fascinating counterfactual, isn't it? I think it's very hard to give a definitive answer. But I think with a lot of things involving Keynes, I think it's important to emphasize um, the way these different sort of intuitions intersect, overlap, interact, or affect his thinking at the same time. He is genuinely, deeply an internationalist. I mean, as a member of the Bloomsbury sect, his friends are all artists who love traveling across Europe and learning from the art and literature of other peoples and places. They dream of art uniting the world, but they also don't really think about the world outside of Europe very much. Or if they do, it is in the context of a British imperialism in which I think actually other members of the Bloomsbury set are much more uncomfortable with it than Keynes is. He's relatively comfortable with the UK being top dog in the international milieu, and I think it's really hard to separate a lot of his ideas about the power of the state and the uses of the state from the fact that he's running wartime economic policy for the UK during World War I, which is a war that his friends are protesting against. And even Keynes himself, wrote down, it was a conscientious objector of sorts to the war itself and helps his friends avoid conscription into the army. So he opposes the war in a certain sense, but then he's also the guy who's running British war finance. And I think these ideas are really hard to untangle. Certainly at Bretton Woods, he's talking Britain's own book, right? He's pursuing British interests, and it just happens to be that he is also taking a line that is more favorable or weights more heavily the interests of poorer countries at the table in Bretton Woods. But it's not like he's going around and talking to delegations from these poor countries and saying, hey, let's work together and create a united front against these Americans. I mean, he's still just sort of this British elite who's trying to will this thing across the line from his own distinctive perspective. I don't know. I mean, I think there is a real deep, sincere idealism in Keynes that I find, at least personally, very appealing. And I don't know, honestly, at any particular juncture, how much of that idealism can be separated from and analyzed distinctly from the British imperial project, which I have not a great deal of sympathy for.
So maybe, thinking Keynes as an international figure who has some patriotism toward the Great Britain would be a very short explanation of the thing, because we know that Keynes is not a nationalist figure. He believes that nationalism is, a threat greater than actually socialism, because everyone at the time was just focused on the Soviet Union and their socialism. But Keynes, would say that, nationalism is the actual threat. So I actually put him in a tradition of Karl Polanyi, although that he himself claimed that I am a liberal. He's actually coming from a Polanyi tradition, I would say.
I think that's right. I mean, I think it's slightly more complex than Polanyi because of the imperial milieu, but Keynes describes himself as a liberal socialist repeatedly. And I think he takes the sort of individual rights, dignity of the individual. A lot of the stuff from John Stuart Mill, who I'm writing my next book on, there's a lot of real similarities between the sort of emphasis on individual virtue and cultivation of the mind and a culture of arts and ideas that are very similar between Mill and Keynes. But he doesn't see that leading to sort of, libertaria, I guess. He sees a more equal society, and one where the economic needs he believes the Liberal Party, which is a distinct political party in Britain at the time, needs to be allied with the Labour Party and getting its energy and ideas from the Labour Party. He sees that alliance as being really essential, not the Liberals and the Conservatives. And I think that's, in the domestic setting, he looks very, very much like Polanyi. I think you're right.
To make to make the road to the next question, as a Turkish citizen, I was just thinking about the Turkish case during the First World War and the interwar period. Because after the First World War, when we look at the Treaty of Versailles, we see that Germany has been has been put against very harsh terms in terms of reparations, in terms of debt, and their military capabilities. And Keynes would argue against that, say that all of these restrictions on Germany would just cut any road for Germany to grow as a healthy nation, and it would just create instability in Europe. But we look at the Turkish case at the same years, we see the Treaty of Sevres, which implies pretty much the same harsh bullet points to the Turkey that the same powers did to Germany as well. So my inquiry is that did Keynes thought about the Kemalist revolution that overthrew Sevres and just brought in Lausanne that provided Turkey to grow as a healthy nation and to get integrated into the Europe?
Keynes almost never talks about anything outside of Europe. I mean, it's one of the most striking aspects of the economic consequences of the peace. I mean, if you look at what goes wrong at the Treaty of Versailles, and I think things went pretty wrong there, there are a lot of things that go bad there that Keynes just isn't focused on at all. I mean, I think I said in the book, he doesn't talk about anything involving oil, which is, even if you're just thinking strictly from an economics and resources perspective, I mean, oil is a pretty big deal coming out of that war. And he's just not on it at all. And I think part of that is just fairly straightforward British or European chauvinism. He doesn't, he occupies himself with, he's predominantly preoccupied with Britain and Western Europe. Those are also just the places he knows best. They're the economies that are most like Britain. And he has very good data on what is happening in German industry. So one of the reasons that the economic consequences of the peace, which was his critique of the Treaty of Versailles, sells so well is because there are tables and charts in the back with economic statistics. And it's actually really hard to get your hands on this stuff in 1919. The concept of GDP as something that we measure doesn't come along for another 20 years. So it's, he's working with what he knows in addition to having, I think, some blinkers on. I think that, the economic criticisms of that book, you can find them in plenty of places. I think one of the things, there's two things that I think are really important about it. One is that the conception of the economy that Keynes had in 1915 and 1919 changed radically on the road to the general theory. The general theory and the assumptions about how the economy works are completely different from those in 1919. I mean, Keynes basically believes that the only way to get a global economy going again is through the miracle of free trade, that free trade will create this abundance that is otherwise impossible. He doesn't really believe that by 1937, certainly not by 1946. He's not opposed to free trade as such. He just doesn't see it as this miraculous thing. So if you think that international trade is the key to making everything work, then you really, really want to get the international trading system going again. And in 1919, the economies that Britain is trading with most are the economies in Western Europe. So that system is the system that you would analyze if you're thinking about the world that particular way. I also think it's important that even though Keynes revised his economic ideas, and I think there are a lot of plausible critiques of the economic consequences of the pieces, economics at least, people at the time found this incredibly persuasive. And the reason they found it persuasive is because they shared his ideas about how the economy worked and how the world worked. So going back and saying he didn't have the economic sort of conceptual landscape correct at this point in time, it's not like Keynes just shows up and hoodwinks everybody and convinces them to believe something that's false if you think the economics are false. He tells people a story that is based on a set of premises and beliefs that people already widely share. And it's extremely influential as a result. And most of the discussion around that book, I think, ignores that fact. But to answer your question directly, no, he says almost nothing about the Turkish situation at any point across his career.
So when you phrase that he's trying to make everything work and everything according to him is basically the balance of power in Europe. He's trying to reestablish the status quo in the 19th century, I think. And you know, outside countries outside of Europe were not a part of that status quo. I mean, precisely, especially the United States and other actors that are present in the 20th century.
I wouldn't want to say that he actively wants to hold down other countries. I mean, he critiques part of Keynes's idealism is when he finds, going back to his days as an undergraduate at Cambridge. Keynes never got a graduate degree, by the way. So for those of you who are not interested in graduate school but like Keynes, there's hope for all of us. He accuses the British government of gunboat diplomacy, of holding up other countries with weapons, threatening them with war basically if they don't fork over interest on debt, which you know if you're a bank and you lend money, like there's a risk that you won't get repaid. That's why you get interest. So he can be very, very critical of the British government. It's not like he's this hardcore jingoist or something. And I don't think there's anything in Keynes that suggests, oh, I really would like uh, people outside of Europe to be second class players in the world. But I think his sort of set of assumptions, the way he approaches, there's a sort of non-conscious emphasis on Europe, which makes sense if you are somebody who studies big economies and how they interact with each other, because the big economies in the world at this point in time are Germany, France, the United States, and the UK.
Okay. Thank you for that. And just that I think a funny thing that I remember about Keynes that he claimed that he didn't like United States because there were no birds there, there were no pigeons there enough. So no, it seems that if United States was not a great economic power at the time, he had no problem with leaving the United States out of this all of these discussions, I think.
Yeah, I think he likes maybe one American, and that's Franklin Roosevelt. And, and it's perhaps an exaggeration, but yeah, he doesn't have a whole lot of enthusiasm for Americans, for the United States. There's a great line about Bretton Woods where they're holding the conference, in the summer of 1944, and he says, "Please, please, God, do not send us to Washington, D.C. in July." Because if you've ever been to Washington, D.C. in July, it is genuinely horrible. Keynes is not wrong about that. That's not just British chauvinism talking. So that's why they do it in New Hampshire, is because the weather's a little bit better. But even there, not enough birds.
Yes, and unfortunate to Keynes, then we see that after the second half of the 20th century and at the beginning of the 21st century, we see a US-led multilateralism to be established in the international order. I mean, all of the system that we now recognize as international relations has been established during this time with a partial US hegemony in the 20th century and a US hegemony in the beginning of the 21st century. But I think in the 2024 we see to start a lack of multilateralism because especially a concrete example can be given with the lack of cooperation on climate change with the withdrawal of United States from the Paris Agreement during the previous session of Trump's presidency, and now that with the re-election of Trump and with the election of other right-wing parties in the Europe, we see all of these leaders claiming that our countries will no longer, be interested in the greater aspect of the world politics, but we will be focusing on our home countries. And also the global south, the authoritarian global south countries has been trying to undermine this US-led multilateral system, even from very back then. And now with United States and her allies not wanting to hold that system anymore, we see a current crisis of multilateral cooperation. And I don't know that maybe if Keynes would describe this crisis in a different manner than I perceived, but what would Keynes about think all of these problems in the international system and how IMF does not actually try to provide a financial basis for Actually, it tries, but I think it fails to provide a financial basis for all of these countries to cooperate on a multilateral manner.
It's very interesting that Keynes's vision for the Bretton Woods institutions, for the IMF, for the World Bank, um, is to serve as a true internationalist coordinator of economic stability and also uh, sort of an economic foundation for diplomacy to keep war, to make things like World War I and World War II impossible. And because the Soviet Union does not sign the treaty or does not ratify the treaty, um, it just can't do that. I mean, the Cold War starts, and those institutions are affiliated with American hegemony, essentially. I do think within the Bretton Woods institutions, for several years, for a couple of decades, they did serve within the sort of American bloc of the Cold War as a stabilizing and pacifying force. But I think toward the end of the Cold War, you start to see it's not really clear what these institutions are for anymore. And you also see the economics of these institutions changing. I mean, I think a lot of the austerity regimes that the IMF in particular was pursuing, I think the Asian financial crises in the 1990s, there's some really off the wall stuff they were doing, which doesn't seem particularly consistent with either Keynes's basic macroeconomic set of ideas, or I think his belief about what those macroeconomic policies would lead to in terms of global cooperation or conflict. Um, you know, I don't want to. I don't think you can blame the collapse of the world order or the American-led, whatever. What's the term? The rules-based order on austerity programs in the 1990s. I mean, I think ultimately responsibility comes back to the United States government itself. I mean, it has in all of the high ideals that I think the United States was projecting to the world in the late 1980s through the 1990s, were really undermined by the invasion of Iraq, and I think the U.S. support for the Israeli government over the last 2 years has been really hard to square with the language about human rights and shared values that the Biden administration discusses with respect to Ukraine and Russia, for instance. So I think there are contradictions in the American leadership of that system. Um, but I also, to some extent, I kind of, the critics of this way of thinking about the world, well, what really is the alternative? I mean, you see people like Orban and Trump saying, well, we're just going to be nationalists and we're going to go it alone. In a country as big as the United States, you could probably do something like a fairly inefficient autarky if you really wanted to. You could have a fully self-sufficient nation. It would be so hard to get there, though. I mean, I'm somebody who has generally supported a lot of the efforts to preserve or reestablish American manufacturing because I think some of that is good for countries to have. When you have a manufacturing base, there's all sorts of knock-on effects for the economy. Um, the technological frontier right now is in manufacturing. It's not the internet and computers, which Americans, have associated with the future for the last 25 years. I think it's good to have some of that stuff in the United States, and it's okay to have some barriers to trade if it means supporting some sort of global balance in these things. But I don't think countries can go it alone without, establishing tremendous hardship. And the basic idea that through economic cooperation, we can have a more peaceful world. There are a lot of problems that economic cooperation can't solve, but surely there are some. Uh, and if we just give up on it, then you're basically saying, I like economic conflict. And I don't, I just, that just doesn't strike me as a particularly fruitful way forward for people who are interested in global stability and global peace and sharing ideas and all of these other sort of high-minded cosmopolitan values that Keynes espoused. And I think a lot of people who want to undermine that order are, clearly not interested in those things. So that's why these politics are. That's one reason why these politics are popular, is because not everybody shares these values. But at the same time, I agree. The IMF has done all sorts of things that are not consistent with Keynes's vision. But what are you going to do? I mean, if you throw it out, does that make the world a better place?
I mean, actually, lately we had a conversation through Zoom with the Robert O. Cohen, a very prominent liberal scholar, neoliberal scholar, and one of his lately scholarly work is based on consensus multilateralism. So we used his conceptual framework to construct, to lay out what does BRICS and the new development bank actually mean, and we came to the conclusion that it is actually a tool for BRICS countries. The new development bank is a tool for the BRICS countries to contest the multilateral system of the IMF and the World Bank. But as you said, these some values at the core is absent. I mean, the new development bank, with all of its big resources, which is financed mostly by China, still lacks some, I would say, spirits in order to establish a very prominent and functioning multilateral system.
There's this constant push and pull in economics and politics, where if you want to get people from different countries with different traditions and different senses about fair play to come together, then you have to set aside some of those ideological commitments and focus on things that feel more ideologically neutral. And often when we talk about things that are ideologically neutral, we talk about money or resources. And so the idea is that the economy can become a place where people who have differences can agree on some sort of mathematical fundamentals. But if the only purpose of your system is arithmetic, then it's not much of a system. What's it trying to do? To some extent, this thing, you have to have a set of values undermining, or not undermining, undergirding your system. Otherwise, there's no reason for it to fuel cooperation. You need, cooperation is itself an ideal. It is not a neutral concept. And if you're going to cooperate, you have to defuse conflicts, and you have to defuse conflicts, you have to recognize differences. And so it is a very, it's a tricky thing. Whether you're doing that through BRICS or you're doing that through the IMF and the rules-based order.
Yes, it is actually the case, and no, I don't think in a Weberian Protestant way that the Western countries born to achieve that multilateralism, but maybe it was some mere intellectuals that we all like Keynes and the conditions of the time that brought all of this together, and maybe in the future we some of these conditions again realigning and the born of another multilateral system.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting time where I think ideologically, at least in the West, things are pretty scrambled. The set of policies and preferences and ideals that make somebody a liberal or not a liberal or a conservative or a populist or whatever people want to call each other, stuff is all being contested right now in a way that it hasn't for a very long time, certainly not within my lifetime. And we don't know how that is going to play out, but this was happening in in the interwar period between World War I and World War II. It's a funny name because, of course, there are lots of wars that are happening in the interwar period. They just aren't between Germany and the United States. But those, the Keynes, losing his faith in free trade is one of the byproducts of that sort of reshuffling. The Democratic Party, as we know it in the United States, completely changes because of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. I mean, the set of beliefs and ideas, the coalition is just totally different. That's happening again clearly in the United States right now. And whatever happens, even I think there's a decent chance you see a U.S. affiliated block of countries with a lot of institutions with names that are familiar, say IMF over the door, but what those institutions do and which sort of aspects of their history they choose to draw on going forward is really unclear. And you can have a lot of different multilateralisms. You can have a U.S.-led multilateralism. You could have a more power sharing, egalitarian multilateralism. Um, yeah, who knows what's going to happen with the relationship between the United States and China, the United States and Russia over the next decade? I don't think many people in 1999 thought we'd be where we are today. And I'm really reluctant to make predictions about where we'll be in 5 years. I don't
Yeah,
know what another Trump presidency is going to do.
Yes, I mean, when we talk about even the field of international relations, it's a very infant field that we have seen it's emerging in the 20th century. So it's very early for us to talk about, patterns, different patterns, because we have only witnessed just one, and new ones are emerging at the moment.
It's a very, I mean, intellectually, it's a very exciting time to be alive. It's just also a very dangerous time for a lot of people to be alive.
Yes, it is. And oh, as we come to the end of our interview, I would like to put a great emphasis on today's intellectual world. So, Keynes, in your words, was one of the last intellectuals of the Enlightenment. He didn't, just look the world from just one window, and he claimed that, socialism was a good thing from time to time, and liberalism was a good thing from time to time. So, why not consider both of these good things? He claimed, for example, different from his contemporaries, and also, he taught ethics, economics, and politics together, and not, what the neoclassical economists do at the time. They just choose to evaluate these as distinct things from politics and ethics, and they just try to focus on numbers. But Keynes did something much more comprehensive in terms of focusing the all of the social sciences at one time. So, although that in your book you say that John Kenneth Galbraith is one of those people who follow a Keynesian tradition in the 20th century, I am more, curious about the ones that we have in the 21st century, because this is a time where specialization is being valued. I mean, when we talk with a scholar of international relations who focuses just on security, there may be some difficulties on him, on her, or them, commenting on issues on international economics or just domestic economics. So, do we have a Keynesian person at the time who focuses our crisis with the same breath as Keynes did?
I mean, the short answer is no. But I think a longer answer and a more thoughtful answer might involve something like the deterioration of um, the intellectual authority, at least in the United States, of the academy. Um, you know, you can look at look at American economic policy over the last decade. I mean, the macroeconomics profession, the academic macroeconomics profession, was railing against Trump's tariffs in 2018. Um, they're making essentially the same arguments against tariffs today. It made not one iota of difference to policy in the Trump administration or in the Biden administration. I mean, Biden's trade policy was very, very similar to Trump's, um, for better and for worse. And I think part of that is because the economics profession in the United States is overly specialized. People become attached to models more than they become attached to reality. They become obsessed with defending the statistical integrity of, monetarism, the M2, whatever, different ways of approaching the economy, and stop looking at what's happening in the world and thinking practically about what we might do with new information coming in. I mean, Keynes was revising his big theory all the time. And we do a lot of work in not just economics, also in history. These departments become they don't just specialize in a field, they specialize in a particular school of thought within the field, and they're focused on defending their school of thought from other schools of thought. And it becomes it's also happening at a time, at least in the United States, where the academy is contracting, like journalism. I mean, the ideas, the economic support for careers in ideas has been shrinking over the course of my lifetime, and it's harder and harder to make your way in these fields. So if you want to get a job in history, you have to specialize in the gender politics of Nevada silver miners in the 1840s or something. I don't want to denigrate people who focus on the gender politics of Nevada silver miners in the 1940s, but because there's all kinds of interesting work to be done everywhere. But these kinds of very narrow specializations don't lead to big picture thoughts about international relations or war and progress or cooperation, whatever you want to call it. So I do worry about that. So I think if we get another Keynes Galbraith type figure coming out of at least Western countries over the next decade or two, I think it will be somebody who is more closely aligned with politics than with the academy. Maybe somebody who is more deeply ingrained in the day-to-day movement of journalistic ideas than with what's happening in academic journals. Someone who's connected to power and politics the way it happens between peoples and nations rather than between schools of thought and universities.
Well, at the beginning of our interview, you said that you're now working on a new book with the John Stuart Mill. So, my curiosity is that do you think there are any similarities between Keynes and Mill in terms of their breadthness in taking these topics?
I'm so hesitant to talk about the Mill book because when you research these things, you have an interpretation, and then you come across some letter from a random point in time, and it can reorient you towards the entire set of information that you've been dealing with. So I've been working on this book for probably 4 years now. Much harder to write a book with 2 children than to write a book with 0 children, for those of you who are planning book writings and parenting. But I think the short answer is yes. I mean, I see Mill and Keynes operating in the same basic tradition with similar kind of blind spots and also a similar optimism and a similar faith in humanity. At the same time, very different thinkers, very different men. Keynes and Mill are both very distinctive personalities and with very distinctive personal histories that inform their ideas. So, yeah, so that's all I can say right now. Yeah.
Thank you very much for all of your answers and your interest to do this interview. It is always good to think about Keynes because in most of our courses we just focus on him because he just lived in a so interesting time and he has so much influence on everything that understanding him means understanding a partial part of the international relations and political science at the same time.
He's a fascinating window to the era. I mean, it's really hard to understand the 20th century without understanding him. And that's not true for all major intellectuals in a given generation or age. I mean, you could understand the late 20th century without understanding John Kenneth Galbraith, for instance, even though I think Galbraith is a really powerful and fascinating thinker. Keynes really is, I think, a key to understanding the world we live in today, or how it came to be.
Yes, it is. And thank you for everything, and I wish you luck on your new book as well.
Thank you, Ibrahim. It's been so nice talking to you.
Have a nice day.
You too.